On the morning of my 63rd birthday, I found a note on the kitchen counter, my wife's handwriting unhurried, like she'd had time to choose every word carefully, and decided none of them needed to be kind. We've gone to Dallas for the weekend. It would be best if your things were somewhere else by the time we're back. That was all. No explanation. No sorry. Not even my name at the top. I read it once, then again. Then I set it down flat on the counter the way you set down a document you plan to reference later. And I made coffee. I didn't call her. I didn't call my daughter. I sat at the kitchen table in the house I had paid for every month for 6 years and listened to the particular silence of a place that no longer pretended to include you. When my wife and her daughter returned 3 days later, they walked through the front door and stopped. The house was still there. The furniture, the appliances, the towels folded the way I always folded them. But something essential had changed. I watched my wife's face go through 4 expressions in about 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, the start of something that looked like fear. I wasn't there when it happened. I didn't need to be. I already knew what they'd find. I want to tell this the right way. My wife and I met 7 years ago at a church potluck of all places, the kind of Sunday afternoon event where nobody expects to meet anyone important. She laughed at something the pastor said that wasn't particularly funny, and afterward she told me I had a calming presence. I was 56 years old and had been retired from 30 years in civil engineering for about 8 months. Calming felt like a compliment. I accepted it without examining what it might cost me later. Her name was Carol. She was 54, warm in a practiced way, the kind of warmth that felt genuine until you noticed it was distributed evenly to everyone in the room. She'd been divorced for 9 years. Her daughter, who was 20 at the time, had just transferred to a state school 2 hours away. Carol talked about her the way people talk about projects they're proud of. Specifically and at length, she mentioned her daughter's father, a man named Rick, once in that first conversation, and only to say he'd moved to Dallas years ago and wasn't a factor. We dated for a year. I liked her steadiness, the way she kept her home, the way she listened. I liked that she didn't seem to need anything from me specifically, which, I would later understand, was because she hadn't yet decided what she needed. We married at the county courthouse on a Thursday. Her daughter, whose name was Brittany, came to the reception dinner and spent most of it on her phone. She called me by my first name, Walter, in the clipped way you'd address a coworker you'd been briefly introduced to. I told myself that was reasonable. She didn't know me yet. I would earn the warmth. I was patient. That was the thing about me. I had always been patient. Carol's house was hers outright from the divorce settlement, but it needed work. The foundation had a slow settling issue, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but shows up in door frames that stick and hairline cracks that appear in corners every spring. I knew how to fix it. I did. I also replaced the water heater, reframed the back porch, and put a new roof on before the first winter. I didn't do these things to earn anything. I did them because I was capable, and the house needed them, and I was the person standing in it. The mortgage transfer happened in year 2. Carol suggested it when the interest rate dropped. She said refinancing under my name made financial sense because my credit score was higher, and my pension income was fixed and predictable. She wasn't wrong. I signed. My name went on the line. Hers didn't. That detail seemed minor at the time. It wouldn't later. Brittany graduated and moved back home. This I had not fully anticipated. She was 22, newly graduated with a degree in graphic design, and her plan, stated plainly at the dinner table about a week after she arrived with 4 carloads of belongings, was to freelance until she found something steady. Freelancing in practice meant working 2 or 3 hours a day on her laptop and spending the rest of the time rearranging the kitchen to her preferences and leaving dishes in the sink overnight. I didn't say much. I noticed things. I filed them in the part of my mind I used for problems I wasn't ready to name. She had her father's eyes, Brittany did, dark and assessing, always checking the temperature of a room. When she looked at me, she looked through me, the way you look through a window at what's behind it. I was the glass, functional, necessary, but not what she was focused on. Rick, her father, called twice a week. I'd hear her laughing from the other room, voice bright and rising in a way it never was around me. The man had left when she was 11. Absence had made him into something better than presence ever could have. I tried. I want to say that clearly. I asked about her work. She answered in single sentences. I suggested we watch a movie together one evening, and she said she had plans without mentioning what they were. When Carol and I had dinner alone, we talked about Brittany. When the three of us were together, Carol and Brittany talked about things I had no context for, references and memories from a life that predated me. I sat at the head of a table I'd bought and listened, and told myself belonging took time. In year 4, Brittany decided she wanted to pursue a master's degree. The program was good. The cost was significant. She presented it at dinner as a plan already in motion, acceptance letter already in her hand, and looked at her mother, not at me. Carol looked at me. Not a question, a wait. I said I'd cover the first year and we'd figure out the rest as we went. Brittany didn't say thank you. She said it was about time she got serious about her career. Carol touched my arm on the way to the kitchen and said I was a good man. I stood at the sink washing dishes and tried to decide if I believed her. I covered all 4 semesters. Tuition, housing, a laptop upgrade she said was essential for the program. Carol would pay me back when her investments matured. They never seemed to mature. When I brought it up gently after the 3rd semester, Carol said she didn't think we needed to keep a running tally between us. We were married. I nodded. I said, of course. I went to the garage and stood there for a few minutes with the lights off. There is a particular kind of invisibility that comes not from being ignored, but from being assumed. People don't look at the light switch when they flip it. They just expect the light. I had become a light switch. Reliable, consistent, expected. Carol needed me the way the house needed electricity, not because of who I was, but because of what I did. The year Brittany finished her degree, Rick moved back from Dallas. Or rather, he moved to a city about 40 miles away, which was close enough to matter. He started appearing in conversation more. Brittany visited him on weekends. Carol mentioned him once, then twice, then casually the way you mention weather. She and Rick had been texting, she said, just to stay in communication for Brittany's sake. He'd matured. People changed. I listened and said things like, of course, and that's good for Brittany. And I watched the shape of the room shift around me without quite understanding the geometry of it. 6 months before the note on the counter, I started paying attention in a different way. I'm not proud that it took something small to wake me. What woke me was a Saturday afternoon when I came back from the hardware store to find Rick's truck in the driveway. He was in my kitchen drinking my coffee and telling a story that had Carol laughing with her whole face in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in longer than I wanted to count. Brittany sat cross-legged on the counter, smiling at her phone. Nobody heard me come in. I set my bag down. I poured myself a glass of water. Rick nodded at me like I was the visitor. Carol introduced us, her voice 3 degrees warmer than it needed to be. He had a firm handshake and a good jawline, and the easy confidence of a man who had left a family and faced no lasting consequences for it. We talked about sports for 4 minutes. I excused myself to the garage. I didn't confront Carol that night. I sat with what I'd seen and let it arrange itself honestly. This wasn't jealousy. It was recognition. The kind that feels like finally seeing the outline of something that had been there for a long time. I called my attorney the following Monday. Not to start anything, just to understand where I stood. He walked me through it with his usual efficiency. Mortgage in my name, utilities in my name, car insurance covering 3 vehicles, 2 of which I didn't primarily drive. Brittany's graduate loans co-signed by me because Carol had asked me to as a formality, and I had, because that's what I did. Joint bank account, but with a contribution ratio that hadn't been reviewed in years. I said thank you and told him I might be back in touch. He said his door was open. I didn't change anything that week or the week after. I watched, I listened, I learned, for the first time in years, to walk into a room without announcing my presence and notice what I found. What I found was a household that functioned entirely on my name and my money and operated entirely without my input. Carol scheduled around me, not with me. Brittany borrowed my car without asking and returned it with the seat adjusted and the gas low. Rick came by twice more that I counted. Once when I wasn't supposed to be home and came back early. Once for what Carol described as just catching up in my living room with coffee I'd bought. I told myself I wasn't angry. That was true. What I was finished. I just hadn't found the moment yet. The trip to Dallas came up 4 weeks before my birthday. Carol mentioned it over dinner as a done thing, not a plan being discussed. She and Brittany were going to Dallas for a long weekend, she said. Rick was having a small gathering, something to celebrate his new place. It would be good for Brittany. Family reconnection. I asked if I was invited. She paused just long enough. It would probably be easier if it was just them, she said. More natural for Brittany. I said I understood. I helped clear the table. That night, I made 3 phone calls. One to my attorney, one to the bank, one to my oldest friend, a man named Franklin, who had been listening to me talk through my marriage for the last 2 years, with the patience of someone who already knows the ending of the story and is waiting for you to reach it yourself. Franklin said, quietly and without judgment, that I had known what I needed to do for a while. I didn't cancel anything that night. I didn't change passwords or move money or do anything rash. I made a list, a practical list, the kind an engineer makes. What was mine, what I had covered, what would change if I simply stopped covering things that weren't my responsibility to cover. The list was longer on my side of the ledger than I had quite acknowledged before. I was 63 years old. I had worked for 30 years and retired with a pension and savings that were mine, earned cleanly, before I'd ever met Carol. I had walked into a house and made it function better than it had, and been thanked for it the way you thank a contractor. I had paid for a young woman's graduate education and been treated like a billing address. I had watched my name used in every way that required it, and omitted in every way that might have included me. I didn't feel sorry for myself. I felt precise. The weekend of my birthday arrived. My daughter from my first marriage, a good woman who lived in Portland with her husband and 2 kids, had called the week before to ask about plans. I told her I'd visit her in the new year. We made it a date. I woke on Saturday morning and walked down the hall to an empty house. The note was on the counter. I've already told you what it said. I made coffee and read it again, and felt something I couldn't quite name. Not shock, not grief. Something closer to the sensation of finally seeing on paper what you'd been reading between the lines for months. I folded the note once and put it in my pocket. I called Franklin. He answered before the second ring. I told him the weekend had arrived and he said he remembered and asked what I needed. I told him I was ready. He said he'd been ready for me since last spring. I spent Saturday morning not packing but accounting. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and went through every account the way you walk through a house before selling it. Roof to foundation. Nothing missed. The mortgage was in my name, and Carol had never been added. Not because I'd withheld it, but because she'd never asked and I'd never pushed. The utilities followed the same path. Electric, water, gas, internet, all set up under my account when I'd moved in, because it had been simpler. Simpler, I was learning, meant someone had been making it simple, and that someone was me. The car insurance covered Carol's sedan, Brittany's older coupe, and my truck. All one policy, in my name, auto pay from my account. Brittany's graduate loans, co-signed, still had 8 months of repayment left. They would need a different name on them soon. I would send a formal letter. I didn't act immediately. I documented. I emailed myself records. I went through 3 years of bank statements and made notes. This wasn't obsession. This was clarity. The kind you develop when you stop being afraid of what you'll find. On Sunday morning, I packed a bag. Not hurriedly, not dramatically. My good boots, 3 weeks of clothing, my tools from the workshop that were mine specifically and couldn't be argued about, my father's watch, which lived on the nightstand and which I had never once left behind anywhere, my files, my laptop. I left the house clean, dishes done, thermostats set reasonably. I made the bed. 60 years of habit doesn't stop because the circumstances change. I checked into a rental unit that Franklin had told me about, a furnished place above a hardware store outside of town, owned by a man he'd gone to college with, month to month. Clean, quiet in the way places are quiet when they have no history inside them yet. I sat on the edge of the bed and took stock of myself, 63 years old, sitting in a room that smelled of cedar and mild disinfectant, a week of clothing in a bag by the door. I waited for the wave of something terrible to hit. It didn't come. What came instead was a thought I hadn't expected. I hadn't needed to tell anyone where I was going. That was new. On Monday, I began. I called the insurance company first. Separating policies took 40 minutes and 2 transfers. The representative was efficient. I removed Carol's sedan and Brittany's coupe from my coverage effective at the end of the billing cycle. I added a letter explaining the change would require them to establish their own accounts. Courteous, factual. No editorializing. The utilities took longer. Some required a notice period. I gave the required notice and provided the account numbers in writing so Carol could establish her own, if she chose to. I wasn't cutting anything overnight. I was handing things back. returning what had never been mine to carry in the first place. The graduate loan co-signature was the most complex piece. I had a conversation with my attorney that Tuesday. He walked me through the process for removing myself as co-signer once the primary account holder had established sufficient credit history. Brittany, he noted, was 26 with a graduate degree and an income. She could manage it. He filed the necessary paperwork. By Wednesday, I had done what I needed to do. Not everything would resolve in a week. Some of it was slow, administrative, the kind of untangling that doesn't announce itself with drama, but the decisions were made. The direction was set. I felt, more than anything, accurate, like a level finding its line. I didn't call Carol. I wasn't avoiding her. I was letting things arrive in their own order. She called Thursday evening. I was eating soup at the small table in the rental unit. Her name lit up the screen, and I sat and watched it for a moment, and then I answered. "Walter," she said. Her voice was careful, compressed. "There's some kind of problem with the insurance. We got a notice in the mail, and the internet is acting up. It says the account holder changed something." I set my spoon down. I said, "Yes, I made some changes." "What kind of changes?" she asked. "I separated accounts," I said. "Things that were in my name are being transferred to their appropriate owners." A pause, then, "What does that mean?" "It means I've begun returning the things I was carrying on behalf of people who aren't me," I said. "You can't just do that without telling me." Her voice moved from careful to edged. "I could have told you," I said, "the way you could have told me about Dallas." "That's completely different." "In what way?" I asked. I was curious. I wasn't goading her. I genuinely wanted to hear how she would frame it. She didn't answer that. She said, "This affects Brittany. She's still getting settled. This isn't the time to pull the rug." I said, "Brittany has a degree and an income. She can carry her own car insurance." The rug comment, I said, is interesting. I didn't lay any rug. I just stopped holding it down. She told me I was being passive-aggressive, that I was punishing her by doing this quietly instead of having a conversation. I said we could have had conversations. I had tried, on several occasions, to have conversations about how the household finances were structured, and those conversations had been postponed or redirected. She said that wasn't fair. I said fair was the word I kept hearing when things changed in someone else's direction. She softened then, slightly. "Walter," she said, "come home. We can sort this out properly." "That's not my home anymore," I said. "It's yours. It always was." He exhaled. "That's not true. It's our home. You're overreacting." I said, "I don't think so. I think I'm reacting exactly as much as the situation requires." After a moment, I asked if Brittany was all right. Carol said she was furious, that the insurance notice had arrived while she was home, and she'd called Rick to complain about me. I said I understood. I asked Carol to give Brittany my regards, and I meant it without sarcasm. I said I hoped Dallas had gone well. Carol said that wasn't funny. I told her I wasn't being funny. The call ended without resolution. I expected that. Resolution wasn't what that call was for. That call was just the first wave, and there would be more. Brittany called the next morning. I knew she would. She had her father's directness when she wanted something, and her mother's warmth when she was working an angle, and I'd had 6 years to learn which was which. She said, "What are you doing?" Not a question, a statement that expected an answer. I said, "Good morning." She said, "The insurance. Mom said you removed me from the policy. You can't do that." I said, "I can and I have. You'll need your own policy. It isn't complicated, and with your income, you'll qualify without difficulty." "I pay for things with that money," she said. I said, "That sounds like a good start for someone building their own accounts." She changed tones then, more conciliatory, slightly. She said she hadn't wanted things to be like this. She said she knew things had been tense. I said, "Brittany, I don't have any bad feelings toward you. I genuinely don't. But I've been covering expenses for you for several years, and I've received very little acknowledgement of that. And I'm not going to continue doing it. That's not punishment. That's just a change." "You signed on those loans," she said. "That was a commitment." I said the process for removing that co-signature was already in motion, and I'd sent documentation. She would need to refinance the remaining balance into her own name. Her credit history, I said, was sufficient for it. "You're doing this to hurt Mom," she said. I thought about that. I said, "No, I'm doing this because I want to stop hurting myself. There's a difference." She hung up. I sat for a while after that, not with regret, with something quieter. The kind of stillness that comes after a long physical effort when your muscles are tired, but your mind is clear. Franklin came over that evening with takeout, and we ate at the small table and talked about our kids and the weather and an old fishing trip we'd taken 15 years ago, before either of us had made the mistakes we'd later spent, years living inside. He didn't ask me how I was feeling in a way that required a complicated answer. He just sat across from me and ate his food and let the evening be what it was, which was simple and undemanding and good. I slept better that night than I had in months. The next call I took was from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a man's voice said, "Hey, this is Rick." I held the phone a moment. Then I said, "I know who this is." He said, "Look, I know this isn't my business, but Brittany's upset, and I told Carol I'd reach out, man to man." I said, "That's thoughtful of you." He said, "You seem like a decent guy. I just think everyone's gotten worked up, and maybe if you came back, had a real conversation." I said, "Rick, with respect, you left when Brittany was 11 years old. You spent 10 years in Dallas building a life that didn't include her. I spent 6 years in the same house as her, covering her education and her car and her phone plan, and watching her look through me like I wasn't there. I'd be careful about invoking man to man." He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "She's had a hard time with me being gone. It wasn't easy for her." I said, "I know it wasn't, and I tried to be steady for her through it, but steady isn't invisible, and I've been functioning as furniture for a long time. I wish Brittany well. I genuinely do. I just won't be funding that wishing anymore." He said something else, but I was already finished with the call. I thanked him for reaching out and ended it. I went back to the mortgage attorney that Friday. We had already begun the process of discussing options. Carol's name had never been on the title. What that meant practically was that there were real decisions to be made about the property, and they would require Carol's cooperation at some level, which meant they would require a formal process. I was not trying to remove anyone from a house overnight. I was clarifying what belonged to whom, which was something that should have been clarified years earlier, before I'd attached my signature to everything quietly and called it love. My attorney said that the process would take time. I said I had time. I was 63 years old, with a pension, a clean credit history, and nothing immediate to prove. Carol called Sunday evening. A different voice this time. The careful compression was gone, and in its place was something more honest, or at least more tired. She said Brittany had found a policy and transferred the car insurance herself. She said it had taken Brittany one phone call in 40 minutes, and she'd done it without asking for help. I said that was good to hear. Carol said quietly that she'd been sitting with what she wanted to say, that she hadn't handled things well, that leaving the note the way she did had been cowardly and she knew it, that she and Rick had been in contact more than she'd told me and she knew how that had looked. I listened. I didn't interrupt. She said, "I didn't think you'd leave. I didn't think you'd actually go." I said, "I know. That's the thing about people who stay too long. When they finally leave, it surprises everyone, including themselves." She said, "I don't know how we got here." I said, "I do." Quietly and not unkindly, I said, "I became necessary without being valued. That's a slow process. It doesn't happen in a week. It happens in 1,000 small moments where someone assumes instead of asks, and the person who's been assumed into a role keeps showing up because they've confused reliability with belonging." She was quiet for a long time. She asked if I was coming back. I said no. Just that. Not cruel, not drawn out, just accurate. She said she wanted to talk again, when things were less raw. I said I was open to that when the time was right. We had practical matters to address, and we would address them properly. But as for coming back to the house and the life and the shape of things we'd built, no. That door had been written shut in someone's unhurried handwriting and left on a kitchen counter on a birthday morning. After the call, I put on my coat and walked to the end of the block and back. The night was cold and clear, the kind of winter that doesn't apologize for itself. I stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, looking at the lit windows in the houses around me, and thought about the years I'd spent filling rooms that weren't waiting for me specifically. I didn't feel sorry. I felt like a man standing in his own air. My daughter called from Portland the following week. She'd heard through the quiet channels that things had changed. She asked how I was. I told her I was fine, genuinely, and that I was taking care of practical matters and looking at whether I wanted to stay in the area or possibly come out toward her end of the country for a while. She got quiet in the way people do when they're trying not to seem too hopeful. She said she'd like that. I said I might too. I had lived for 6 years in a house that ran on my name and my work and didn't ask me what I wanted for dinner. I had signed things because I was asked to and paid things because it was easier. and smiled at a table where the conversations ran past me like water around a stone. I had done it because I am the kind of man who shows up, and I hadn't yet understood that showing up and belonging are not the same thing. My father, who built houses for 40 years in the Ohio River Valley, used to say that a structure is only as sound as what it's built on. He was talking about foundations. He might have been talking about this. I think about the note sometimes, not with bitterness, more as a reference point, the way you remember the moment a fever broke. It said what it said in my wife's handwriting, and it meant what it meant, which was that somewhere between the refinancing and the roof repair and the graduate tuition and the insurance policies, I had been sorted from person to infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't need to be informed. It's just expected to hold. But infrastructure can be decommissioned, quietly, with documentation and proper notice and without making a scene. I didn't ruin anyone's life. I returned responsibility to its appropriate owners and removed my name from arrangements that had never been equal. Carol would figure out the mortgage. Brittany would carry her own loan. Rick would continue to exist at a convenient distance and be mythologized accordingly. And I would be 63 years old, in a clean room above a hardware store, with my father's watch on the hook by the door, and nobody's expectations hovering over my morning coffee. There's something I want to say to anyone who recognizes themselves in this. Not the specific facts of it, but the feeling. The feeling of being necessary without being seen, of having your name on everything except the conversations that matter, of waking up one day and realizing you built a life inside someone else's house, and somewhere in the building forgot to ask if you lived there. You are allowed to take your name back. You are allowed to stop holding things up that were never yours to hold. Not in anger, not in revenge, just in the clean, precise knowledge that your usefulness to someone is not the same as your worth to the world. I found that knowledge late, 63 years old and sitting in a room that smelled of cedar and new starts, listening to the sound of a life that asked nothing of me and gave me everything in return. Rest, I found out, is not what you get at the end. It's what you find when you stop performing for people who forgot to wonder how you were doing. If that landed somewhere in you, I'd like to hear where you're watching from. We tell these stories here every week. The quiet ones. The ones that don't end in a fight but in a realization. In a morning that's finally, after a very long time, just yours. Subscribe if you'd like to be here for the next one. I'll be here.